Fantastic. So thank you everyone for attending today and welcome to the webinar on corporate due diligence and sustainability systems. It's great to see such a wide range of stakeholders on this public event. The agenda for today then will firstly be thinking about just some background on due diligence and the work that ISEAL is doing in this space. And that's going to be led by David Dollender, who's Manager, Policy and Innovations. We'll then be going on to our first panel section. So we're really privileged today to be joined by a fantastic panel who will be introduced and moderated by Vidya Rangan, who sees the Senior Manager, Impact and Innovations. We'll then be talking in more detail about the ISEAL Code of Good Practice and how that's incorporated due diligence. And I'll be leading that section. And then finally, we'll be having a last panel section moderated again by Vidya. And at the end of those two panel sections, there'll also be chance for any questions from the audience. So you will be again prompted to put questions into the chat box at that point. Some brief context before we go into the detail of this webinar today, and that this is one of a range of events that we've been holding as part of the consultation on the ISEAL Code of Good Practice. So the ISEAL Code of Good Practice, very briefly, operationalizes the credibility principles that ISEAL has actually revised last year. And the ISEAL credibility principles define the core values of credible and effective sustainability systems. I won't go into any more detail at that than this stage, but the graphic on the screen demonstrates what those credibility principles are. And I would encourage you to take a look at that if you're interested in finding out more detail. So the code is operationalizing these credibility principles. And for those that are new to ISEAL, the intention of the code is that it's defining the credible practices and the components of a sustainability system, and that it provides a framework to not only recognize this, but also support sustainability systems in the development of these. For those that are familiar with ISEAL, they'll be already aware that there's 3 existing codes of good practice, so in assurance, standard setting, and impacts. And what the ISEAL Code of Good Practice is doing is revising and integrating these, and also including some essential components of the claims guidance that was already existing. A couple of terminology points before I move on. I've used the phrase sustainability systems, and I recognize this is a term that's used differently in many different contexts. So I just wanted to clarify exactly what I mean in ISEAL's framing. So for ISEAL, when we refer to a sustainability system, what we're talking about are initiatives that have these 5 components. So defining a performance level, assessing that, measuring performance over time, and then communicating that through claims or wider communications, and then learning from these results and impacts. So for the variety of different sustainability systems, they will have a different mechanism of doing each of these components. But because there are these shared elements, it means that the credibility principles, the ISEAL code, has a common framework, and that's what we're really focusing on when we're talking about these systems. Lastly then, for context, is just on the consultation. So as I mentioned, we are partway through now the consultation on the ISEAL Code of Good Practice, and this ends on the 16th of December. And what we're trying to do here is get as wide a range of feedback as we can from all of the stakeholders, and that will enable us to think about how we can make sure the code is meeting its aims and objectives, and we'll use all of this feedback to inform the next revision. So I'm now going to hand over to my colleague David, who's going to talk through the next section in a bit more detail on due diligence. Over to you, David.
Really great to see a good turnout today. So my name is David Dollender. I work for ISEAL. I'm a manager, and I've been leading on our due diligence work stream for the past years. And so if you understand ISEAL as an organization that brings together a range of different voluntary standard systems, sustainability systems, then really our work on due diligence is about reflecting what this means for them, how they should adapt and innovate to this, and how they can kind of meet these new expectations that are emerging from different, either the regulatory side or more global, international kind of soft law frameworks. And so what I will do is just set out a couple of broad background points that I think should not be anything new for many of you here, I just saw on the poll that quite a lot of people are familiar with due diligence, so this is not going to be anything hugely new. But then I will also talk a bit about how at ISEAL we're looking at this and kind of share some ideas about how we think the integration between voluntary sustainability systems and due diligence can look like. I'm going to try to do this pretty quick because we have an excellent panel lined up after this. So first of all, I thought it would be useful just to flash the definition of due diligence here again. Most of you are going to be very familiar with this. We chose to use the OECD due diligence guidance definition here because it's a global reference point. It's not just focused on human rights, as are the UN guiding principles, and they are very holistic. And that's also how we think about sustainability systems at ISEAL. So ISEAL is cross-sectoral. We work across a whole range of different areas. And so the two main questions then, if you take this definition of due diligence, the two main questions that we're trying to answer is, well, first of all, how can sustainability systems and standards support, facilitate, and strengthen corporate due diligence? So this is really the question of how can sustainability systems and standards be due diligence tools? And how can they get better at being useful due diligence tools? And then the second question is, what organizational policies and processes do our members or do sustainability systems in general need to put into place themselves? And so this is a slightly different entry point because here we're thinking about a sustainability system or standard as a non-state actor in its own right. What type of responsibilities do they have in terms of doing human rights due diligence or due diligence in general? So it's a slightly different entry point to this question of due diligence for our members and for standard systems. But often there's quite a lot of overlap then in how we can think about adaptation and innovation. So if we move on to the next slide, so obviously besides international soft law frameworks like the OECD, UN guiding principles, we all know there's quite a wide range of hard laws or mandatory regulations around due diligence that have come up in the past decade. So I'm obviously not going to talk through all of these that we have in this non-exhaustive table here, but just to indicate that there's quite a wide variety in this, right? So not just in terms of which countries are legislating due diligence regulations, but also the scope in terms of being commodity specific or issue specific. And then of course, there's a whole range of variety in terms of what is actually mandatory, what is more guidance, etc. Now, to a certain extent, this poses quite a challenge in terms of how a global standard system, which most of our members are, how they need to adapt to this, because there's quite a lot of variety. And frankly, it's the same challenge for a lot of companies that are trying to navigate and look at this, of course. Now, importantly, as most of you probably know, at the EU level, there is some push for harmonization. And so some of the ones down on the table are currently under discussion at the EU level. So the EU CSDD, Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence proposal, is of course quite a quite an important piece of regulation, and that is going to stretch across a number of EU countries. MS stands for member states in terms of the enforcement. If you see any errors or things wrong with this table, do let us know. It might be that the latest amendments and changes in some of these ongoing discussions might mean this is now a bit outdated. So do get in touch if you see anything wrong. But just to move on from this and really step back, if we try to understand due diligence as a broader concept and in how it relates to voluntary systems and standards, the first thing to obviously note is that all of these establish a clear legal floor requiring companies to have certain processes. And this is really necessary, and this is obviously something that a voluntary system can do. This is just by their nature, obviously. And so what we can then say is that broadly, all of these regulations require some type of process for identifying and managing risks in operations and supply chains. And again, there's some variety in how far companies need to go in terms of tier 1 or further down. There's a big difference in terms of regulations that just look at a specific commodity, and then they can set quite clear criteria that then kind of become market obligations or market access obligations. So for example, the EU timber regulation or EU regulation on conflict minerals is very specific And that just means the due diligence process really relates to market access for specific products. And then you have due diligence regulations that look from a broader company-wide perspective at what type of processes does a company need to have in place, how can they continuously improve and work and develop that due diligence policy and implement it. So that's a slightly different type, and it's quite important to set those two apart because the implications for standard systems and sustainability systems can also be quite different. And then the last point here is that in terms of what these laws actually require, well, we've seen about a decade ago, a lot of these laws were mainly focused on just reporting and creating transparency. Now there's increasingly responsibility and accountability across the whole due diligence cycle. So that's that's got quite an interesting and important trend. Now, importantly for ISEAL and of course for the topic of this webinar is that there's an increasing role for voluntary systems and standards as well as industry initiatives in the implementation of due diligence. And so, for example, in the EU proposed horizontal due diligence regulation, there is quite a specific role for these type of initiatives and organizations. And so that, of course, means there's a lot of discussion about what does it mean for a company to use these type of systems and organizations to do due diligence. And that's something, of course, that we're really interested in unpacking and understanding better. But importantly, and I think this needs to be, cannot be stressed enough, that even though companies can use voluntary systems, standards, and industry initiatives, this does not relieve them for their actual individual responsibilities in terms of due diligence. So that's something that's also quite clear. So if we move on then, all of this was kind of background. I hope I didn't say anything too controversial necessarily. Now I kind of want to focus on how at ISEAL we kind of want to contribute and be a constructive actor in this space. And so this is kind of broadly our vision about what we want to do with our members. So the idea that sustainability systems can really be tools to implement effective, fair, and impactful due diligence processes. And I think these qualifiers, effective, fair, and impactful, are important to stress because we simply know that if due diligence is going to be applied across a whole range of companies, then some of them are going to do a good job and others are going to do, let's say, as cheap a job as possible. And that means that there's going to be a huge variation and range in how due diligence is going to be implemented. And as sustainability systems, we see quite a big role to make sure that these processes actually lead to impactful and the outcomes that we want to see. And that is not something, of course, that just ISEAL is looking at. A lot of our other organizations are looking at that. And we think that, again, sustainability systems have quite a unique role in all of that. So what that means, again, thinking about better alignment and interoperability, and then also thinking about strengthening the organizational policies of sustainability systems and standard systems in line with these emerging due diligence expectations. And that's, of course, where our code revision and what Lucy is going to talk about later today also comes in. Now, the last slide that I have, I wanted to just give a little bit more of a flavor of the potential roles and existing roles that standards and systems can already play as due diligence tools, and hopefully this can also give some food for thought for our panelists coming up. So first of all, sustainability systems and standards can provide reliable and actionable data. And I think to a certain degree, a lot of them are already doing that. But there's also no question that they can get better at that. And really, our code looks a lot at data management and how sustainability systems and standard systems can get better at data management and can provide more relevant data over time. Then they can also go above and beyond mandatory minimums. So currently, in the if you look, for example, at certain due diligence law will have really specific criteria, and then it's quite easy for a standard system to identify that and then identify what they can do beyond that. For other due diligence regulations, it's a bit more complicated because the the legal good enough minimum is not yet clearly established. So it's quite difficult for voluntary systems to identify that and already say, well, let's try and go beyond that. So these are going to be kind of interactions that we see, in the coming decades of implementation around these due diligence laws are going to allow sustainability systems to go above and beyond mandatory minimums and really drive company performance on those sides as well. Then creating sector-wide consistency and transparency is, I think, quite an obvious role. I think what we're seeing, the potential that due diligence processes will be interpreted widely differently by different, let's say, buyers, and then producers have to cater to a whole range of different due diligence demands is something that, we know is being flagged as something that's going to be quite complicating the implementation of this. So there's this question of, okay, how can sustainability systems drive better consistency, but also better data disclosure across a whole sector, for example. And then lastly, that leads into the final point, is that how can sustainability systems drive and enable collective action? So if you think about due diligence regulations as establishing clear individual responsibilities for companies, which is essential and important, but we also know that a lot of these problems in supply chains are collective action problems. How can we make sure that sustainability systems and standard systems look at that collective side? What are the type of tools and programs and interventions that can happen collectively? And again, implementation partnerships can mean a range of things, right? It can do, doing mitigation together or remediation together, etc. So I'm going to stop here, and I will pass over to Vidya, who's going to moderate our panel.
Thanks so much, David and Lucy. And again, welcome everybody to this session today. We're at that stage of the session where we're going to be hearing views from our panelists. We have three very distinguished speakers joining us for the discussion today. We're very happy to have Emily Norton from the OECD, who's been working quite closely on the regulatory environment and the role for sustainability standards. We have Professor Dorothy Bowman-Pauly, who leads the Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights at the University of Geneva. And very happy to have Archana Kotecha, who leads an organization called the Remedy Project, who work globally, but also specifically in the Asia-Pacific region at the intersection of human rights, due diligence and regulation, and remediation. A very warm welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us today. Let's begin our panel with some reflections from you all on what you've heard so far from David, but also your work in this space. This is a fast changing space. It has implications for the private sector, for the public sector, and for actors in the voluntary sector as well. So I'd like to go around our panelists and get some opening remarks from you, probably 2 minutes, on what you see are the biggest trends that you're picking up and where we should focus our attention. Emily, shall we begin with you?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you so much to ISEAL, of course, for the invitation, and great to be here on an important topic. Just to say that I work on both regulatory, so particularly the EU law, but also on what we call our alignment assessments of the OECD, where we actually assess particularly the alignment of initiatives with the due diligence frameworks that we host and hold, but also actually what we call credibility assessment as well, and very much hoping to collaborate a little bit more with ISEAL on some of that. Just to say that I think learnings for us through all of the sector work that we've had, of course, for many years, and just to reiterate, I think hearing that, a new and evolving context, of course, the UNGPs and the OECD standards on due diligence have been around for quite some time, actually. And I think that's what we do see, therefore, is a huge variety in experience with them, and that comes across in the initiatives as well. And so we've been working for over 10 years, of course, with initiatives in the minerals sector that do have a history of being rooted in the OECD standards, rooted in due diligence, many of them, obviously on some of them very specific minerals relating to legislative developments initially in the US, but we see that context versus quite a different context that we look at in the garment and the agri sectors, for example, where, of course, very long history of very, very interesting and robust schemes doing a lot of work, but just less background in the due diligence, risk-based due diligence, and in some ways less integration of due diligence as a result, and that can mean obviously in the garment sector we're seeing an interesting movement though towards due diligence and towards integrating due diligence with sort of hybrid models moving towards brand performance checks, of course, and even in the case of the green button, you know, these due diligence certifications at the downstream level. So there's clearly an interesting direction of travel. And then the agriculture sector, we're just starting pilot assessments now actually in the agriculture sector, and that's of course a sector very rooted in certifications, and lots of questions of course being asked in the sector, and the MSIs that we're talking to about the role of certifications in the mandatory context, and of course particularly where there's a background of chain of custody traceability combined with these certifications, you know, what are the downstream responsibilities that go beyond traceability. We're seeing of course these new concepts of shared responsibilities in the sector. And so it's a very interesting time for us to be seeing all of this movement and the very different dynamics in each sector. And I think maybe knowing that I don't have too long to speak, and hopefully we'll have a lot more time through the panel, I think what we're really keen to see is just that much more clarity really about what particular initiatives do and don't do. I think we don't really want to be pushing a model that sort of says initiatives need to do everything they possibly can across all 6 steps. And I think certainly the background we've had over the last 10 years with these initiatives is that initiatives can be more effective when they're narrow in focus, and you know, target their resources and expertise in really efficient ways. So I think there's a big risk perhaps that we push schemes too far and to be too broad and too comprehensive, when actually we need to recognize that there should be models to accept different types of schemes, different scopes. But again, as David said, there need to be these parameters. And I think the work ISEAL is doing is brilliant and super important, particularly around the substantiated claims, the transparency. And I think with our own assessments, we're really trying to push a little bit more on the transparency, the types of information that is so helpful to have from these initiatives, and the types of information they should be pushing for from companies. But yeah, sorry, and I can speak later maybe to just some of the due diligence, the changes that we're seeing in the way that initiatives could be better integrating due diligence, but lots to say. Thanks.
Thanks, Emily. And yes, indeed, some sort of alignment already between some of your thoughts and what we heard from David. But let's go to our next speaker. Dorothy, would you like to go next with some opening remarks?
Yes, with pleasure. Thanks for having me, and thanks for encouraging a debate that is trying to instill rigor into a debate that I think has been, on the one hand, floating at a really high level and leaves lots of room for interpretation around human rights due diligence. At the same time, we're talking about sustainability system that still lump together many very, very different organizations. And I think we'll get to that. But at the beginning, I want to sort of remind us all of the narrative that actually drove the emergence of mandatory human rights due diligence. And that was a growing consensus, particularly amongst civil society organizations, that what they called voluntary systems don't work. They don't deliver the desired results. And hence there was sort of the push to now legislate and make this mandatory. And we have pointed out in our research that this is an entirely false dichotomy. First of all, many of those so-called voluntary initiatives are not voluntary at all once you signed up for them. I'm thinking of multi-stakeholder initiatives whose membership really obliges its members to deliver. Mandatory component of mandatory human rights due diligence can be quite relative, because currently, as David pointed out, the requirement to engage in mandatory human rights due diligence is mostly focused on procedural elements. So the content that would be measurable still has to be defined. So we are arguing to flesh out mandatory human rights due diligence, we actually need another step of operationalization to make progress transparent and measurable. And this operationalization could happen through the avenue of, for example, multi-stakeholder initiatives or sustainability systems broadly. Hence, we would reframe this original narrative, which argued, well, it's an either or, voluntary, mandatory, false dichotomy. We would say those sustainability systems are a necessary complement to the now emerging mandatory human rights due diligence legislations, because they cannot remain at this high level. We don't want companies just to go through the moves of procedural checks. We have a policy, we have a procedure. No, we actually want to add substance. And here I built on Emily's comments. Narrower is often better, because then you can define very clear and measurable indicators actually define in very clear and measurable terms what is expected of companies. Companies right now, at least from my experience, are still not entirely sure what they're signing up for. And uncertainty is not what they desire. They clearly want to know where is the benchmark. And I think defining legitimate standards through sustainability system is the necessary complement to now the legal requirement to conduct human rights due diligence. So this is how I see this relationship, and maybe this is useful to kick us off.
Indeed, thank you, Dorothy, and thank you for underlining that point about the complementarity and the false dichotomy between the two approaches. Finally, let's hear from Archana. Archana, you come at this from a similar but also a very distinct angle and frame of work. So what are your opening thoughts?
Sure, thanks, Vidya, and thanks for having me on this panel. I guess, I sit in Southeast Asia, and we are in the producing countries. So we are receiving these due diligence systems in a different way, not being directly subject to it, although some companies operating in Southeast Asia are. One of the interesting things really is that for me as an advocate in the space of remedy, these mandatory due diligence systems have brought a whole new focus on grievance systems, complaint systems, and remediation systems, which is, music to my ears. For a very long time, we've been talking about how systems of remedy are so critical for rights holders, but also from the perspective of being a means of proactive due diligencing, because remedy systems can act as an early warning signal and are so important in this sort of suite of measures and services that need to exist at these different levels. I think the other interesting thing for us is to really see the state take a very active role in this space. So far as measures have been, voluntary, the standards have been variable depending on how many resources, how far ahead companies are in their sustainability journey. We have seen, for example, at SME levels, many problems existing and the lack of resources, etc., really impacting the ability to provide, this sort of engagement towards affected communities and worker communities. And also with the emergence of the ESG movement and the focus on what the private sector is bringing to the table, in many cases, I feel the state has taken a back seat, and it's quite good to see the state get back into the active role of respecting, protecting, and remedying in terms of the impact of adverse business activity on human rights. I think one of the welcome aspects of having these due diligence systems is, of course, creating legal certainty. And I think, it also brings us to the broadening out and the convergence of not just, modern slavery, forced labor, human trafficking issues, but a broader range of human rights issues, and also the convergence of human rights and environmental and governance issues, which is so important because up until now, we have really looked at these as different silos that have coexisted along each other, but not really necessarily meshed with each other. So I think it's really interesting to see that. But I'd also like to echo the point of the need for complementarity between state-based mandatory approaches and non-state-based approaches. So the approaches of the MSIs and other private sector initiatives that are so important, because when I look at remedy as an area in itself, it takes multiple points of access into the world of remedy for affected rights holders to be able to be made whole. And, just a final reflection, I think the emergence of all of these laws hails from the OECD guidelines and the UN guiding principles. And I think this is a really good time for us to realign ourselves around the centrality of the rights holders, which is often something that gets lost in the myriad of legal lingo and, in the compliance-based approach. So looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Archana, and thanks to all of you for those opening remarks. In the 20 minutes we have left, I want to quickly explore with the panel two broad questions. The first, really, what's going to change with all this mandatory due diligence that's coming through? And then want to go on to the question about, what can we do to better integrate the complementarity between the voluntary and the mandatory? So let's start with the question around what's going to change. Dorothy, in your opening remarks, you spoke very eloquently about just what the impetus has been for the emergence of mandatory due diligence. So let's first come to you. What do you see as the most significant changes that this shift is going to bring? What's going to change for companies? What's going to change for the public sector, and then of course for the voluntary sector as well?
Big question, thank you. I think a lot of things will change, and I'm mostly excited about the fact that the legal requirement puts our agenda very high on corporate agendas, because now it's no longer nice to have, but actually mandatory to engage, at least. But of course, we want to make sure that the engagement is meaningful and impactful for the rights holders. So on that level, I think there's still work to do. I hear Archana, who says clearly that often forgotten sort of remedy portion is now really getting a lot more attention and backing through the mandatory nature of human rights due diligence. But as I said in my introductory remarks, I think, and I want to use actually John Ruggie's quote here. He said, we're at the end of the beginning, as he published the UN Guiding Principles for Business Human Rights, which made the mandatory or the human rights due diligence concept central for companies. We're at the end of the beginning because we still need to further define what does this actually mean for companies that work in very specific industry contexts. I've done tons of field work, and I think it's an interesting anecdotal observation that not once in my field work anybody mentioned the UN Guiding Principles to me. They're very high level. What I did encounter, however, in multiple forms, are references to sustainability systems. In my work with companies, I know that they are in use every day, that they're a key reference point, and they're just practical. They emerged because there were, for example, in global supply chains, issues that no actor alone can address, often systemic issues, very specific to specific supply chains. And those multi-stakeholder initiatives emerged because of a very specific need. And they've also delivered to a certain extent over the past years. And I think that need won't go away. Instead, I would argue it will go up, because I see growing governance gaps in global supply chains around the world. So there's a practical need that will still need to be fulfilled. And also, I think it's important to note that the mandatory human rights due diligence movement is happening in Europe right now. I actually have a double affiliation. I'm also with NYU Stern in the US, and they're very far from a mandatory human rights due diligence debate. So in a way, we're also talking about an insular sort of perspective where this requirement will come for European-based companies that, of course, have global supply chains around the world, but it will not be mandatory to engage in human rights due diligence in other parts of the world. Yet, of course, we want all workers and communities to see positive impacts from business engagement. And so I think the role of sustainability systems is unwavered, if not even greater than ever before, to give substance and meaning to our commitment that companies have a role to play in affecting positive change.
Thanks, Dorothy. And I think your point about the fact that this is quite Eurocentric right now means that some things are going to change, but maybe some others are not. And so while this is very dynamic within Europe, maybe a lot is not going to change in other jurisdictions. Emily, let's come to you. Obviously, the OECD is at the heart of a lot of what's happening right now in the regulatory policy environment. What do you think are the big things that are going to change for the actors involved?
Thanks. No, thanks a lot. Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I would love to agree, and I do agree with Dorothy. There's so much that could change, and of course, I think the reality is we have to see what comes out of the EU on this law, and ultimately the design of this legislation is so critical. It will directly impact, of course, how companies interpret the law, and then, of course, the role that MSIs play in that. And whilst I totally agree, I mean, it's brilliant to have this spotlight, and as the standard holder, it's obviously brilliant to see that there's this political will to make this mandatory and to really scale up something that really has sat in some sectors with a sort of responsible few, if you like, and to really push the whole sectors up to a certain level. But I think, yeah, I mean, and just sorry on that, I totally agree. The role of initiatives is going to be critical. We're talking at such scale now, and so big learning curves that are going to need to happen, particularly for SMEs, but more broadly as well, that initiatives are going to have a very big role, I'm sure, practically, whether or not, or however they're framed in the law. I think in practice, that there is a very significant role. But just to say, I think there is, of course, concern from many stakeholders, not least the CSOs, that this will sort of lead to a growing over-reliance on initiatives and almost less good due diligence, as if initiatives are given too much centrality in the law. And I think we're moving towards an interesting area where, again, it really will depend on how the law is written. But ideally, we're going to be in a position where we have a lot more scrutiny on initiatives to be more transparent, show what they're doing, and so have that clarity that would be brilliant, but also have actually the increasing use of them. So hopefully that's the way we'd hope it would go. But just always, I think the big challenge for policymakers is just to make sure that to tackle this sort of dependency on audits, dependency on initiatives, and the downstream now, at least under our standards, have a much bigger role than looking at I mean, in many cases, they don't even see the audit report, of course, but, a much bigger role than just looking at an audit finding or a label or a sticker. And that's where, hopefully, if this goes in the right direction, we will see the downstream being much more engaged. And of course, I mean, maybe we'll come to this later, but I think the risk-based nature of due diligence is something that many companies, many initiatives are actually quite far away from. There's still a tendency in a lot of sectors with a lot of companies to just focus on tier one, focus on where they have leverage. Those risks are easiest to control. I'll start there. And that we hopefully, if we do have robust risk-based legislation, we would ideally see a shift away from that sort of sitting back and focusing at that level to much more robust assessments of how to prioritize, where to prioritize in the whole value chain. So there could be some big shifts. Again, let's see what comes out.
Thanks, Emily. And indeed, that's the hope. The hope is that it stops being procedural and actually, companies and their supply chain actors are engaging with risks and solutions to those risks rather than just, sort of eliminating risks entirely. Archana, let's come to you. You alluded to this in your opening remarks, but what's the sense in in the Asia Pacific region, which has a large supplier base that obviously trades with Europe, that supply chain stakeholders that supply into these regions? What's the sense about what due diligence and the mandatory nature of due diligence is now going to change for them?
Thanks, Vidya. I think I should perhaps start by saying that we are a region that has been hit quite heavily by trade-based sanctions. So that has already prepped the ground, in a sense, for what is coming down the pipeline in terms of due diligence systems. So, for example, there's been an enhanced focus around, company policy, the way they identify risk, the way they manage risk, the way they engage with stakeholders, but also the way remedy is provided in terms of recruitment fees, etc. So the ground is being prepped. I think there's a lot of nervousness and trepidation over what the impact of having these EU-centric DD processes is going to look like trickle down to the supply chains. And from what we can see already, we see a lot of, contractual terms and assurances being sought of suppliers in terms of the standards that suppliers can operate to. Again, it is a bit of a minefield, because actually at SME level, this is very problematic. It's very easy for an SME, for a smaller enterprise to give an assurance, but the verification and the backing required in order for this to stand up is really questionable in many cases. I think what organizations in Asia are really hoping for is that there will be a greater degree of support provided to suppliers, further upstream in relation to the types of safeguards and processes that they are expected to be building into their system. For example, the CSDD has a concept around investment in the supply chain. So there is some expectation that there will be support provided in relation to grievance infrastructure, for example, and other services as well. Now, that's where MSIs also have an interesting role to play, because I think MSIs will become a bit more of a convergence point in relation to digesting, distilling, and perhaps providing some of the architecture for companies to have an entry point into accessing these due diligence system. And I think, there will be much more opportunities for peer learning, peer engagement, which can be provided under the banner of these initiatives as well. So I think, one of the interesting things we're seeing is the narrative in Asia has been very focused around modern slavery, human trafficking, and forced labor, because the early iterations of transparency laws, etc., were very much focused on these topics. And now this is branching out to look at, more complex topics of the intersectionality of human rights and the environment, and human rights as a broader concept. And that really has, is something that people are really grappling with. I think finally, the realignment of policies, systems, and audits, etc., that are really risk-based, that are focused on salience of risks, and that are focused around a prioritization of dealing with higher risks depending on sector and geography, is also something that we are seeing companies start to think about. From the state perspective, very little reaction at the APAC level, other than for Japan, that have just issued draft guidelines around the subject of due diligence and remedy, but they are non-binding guidelines. I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks, Archana. So we have about 5 to 7 minutes left for this section of our panel discussion, and I want to quickly capture from our panelists what you think sustainability standards and similar systems need to be doing. If they're doing something good, what do they need to continue? If they're not, delivering yet, what is really needed from them to be able to be good partners and support, these this shift towards mandatory due diligence. So what are the key opportunities for sustainability standards and other MSIs as we move to this new environment? Emily, let's start with you. You've just published a paper on this, and want to tell us a little bit about what you think are the key opportunities. What do they need to do better or continue doing?
Yeah, no, thank you. And big question. So tricky to condense down briefly, particularly as Dorothy and everyone said, we're talking about apples and pears in many cases. But I think the transparency point that I've mentioned, or information disclosure aspect, is key. And I think that one of the big points in the paper, of course, is that clarity around claims and what initiatives do, what they don't do. And I think particularly with the law that is going to be looking at the full value chain, or at least the full supply chain, understanding which initiatives do focus on which parts of the supply chain and which risks, and why they might be focusing on a narrow set of risks, and how companies then need to layer on their own due diligence is going to be so key. So I think that clarity is really a big focus for us. And I think where initiatives do claim or do want to support due diligence and evaluate due diligence across the board. And again, my point earlier that we're not pushing that scope and that degree of effort, if you like. But where there is a claim that that's what an initiative is trying to do, then there really does need to be a more shared understanding of what due diligence is, better integration, better alignment with our standards. And we've really seen, of course, through these assessments that we do, that often what you're reading on paper is not what's happening in practice. And I think our assessments do look very much at the practical implementation through shadow audits, shadow assessments, interviews on the ground with factory managers, trade unions, CSOs, etc. And I think that this is going to be a bit of a challenge where that we will be seeing claims, we will be seeing companies using these initiatives. How are we going to really understand what's happening on the ground and functioning and what's happening in practice? And I think that the pushing by the initiatives, the pushing the companies to report and be transparent on what they're doing, and then on the initiatives themselves can really help that process. It can help people to understand and verify what's being done. So there's a lot that I could say in terms of the due diligence side, but I think really this concept, as Archana we just heard of making sure that the requirements that are set for companies are truly risk-based, that the assessment, the audit methodologies are truly risk-based. Those are really fundamental, as are all the elements of due diligence that we often don't see enough of, like the stakeholder engagement in the monitoring and the tracking. It's not just about CAP follow-up, it's also about rights holder engagement at the site level. It's also about grievance mechanisms. It's also about supplier level engagement. So I think there's a lot that can be done still on understanding the standards and going back to the OECD standards and really working to integrate those into requirements. And then I think clearly ISEAL is doing so much work on the credibility side. That's fundamental.
Thanks, Emily. And Dorothy, I'm going to give the last word to you on this bit of the panel. Your thoughts on what MSIs need to be doing better of or more of, less of.
Thank you. Indeed, we started out with sustainability systems, a very broad category. My research has indeed focused on multi-stakeholder initiatives, and we have also published a paper. I can show you a printed copy of this report here, where we've identified 5 criteria for what makes a robust and meaningful MSI. And this is important because companies now are confronted with so many different organizations and initiatives, and I encourage them to choose carefully, because only some of them, I think, truly deliver and create value. And to us, everything starts with the governance system. We focus on multi-stakeholder initiatives because to us, it's the condition sine qua non. These organizations can actually define standards. So many multi-stakeholder initiatives use the label, but are not truly multi-stakeholder, because often civil society organizations are only relegated to advisory roles. We want each stakeholder group to have the same weighting vote. And this is how everything starts, and flowing from that, clearly we want to see those multi-stakeholder initiatives deriving their standards from international laws and international standards. They should have an independent monitoring system, meaningful enforcement policies. Without sticks, there's no meaning to the standard. And clearly, as Emily pointed out, there's a portion that needs to be transparent. And so there must be a component that allows for public accountability. And to us, these are sort of the 5 core components of what makes a meaningful and robust multi-stakeholder initiative that can further flesh out human rights due diligence through the definition of industry-specific human rights standards.
Great, thank you so much, Dorothy. And that segues really nicely into the next section of today's webinar, where I'm going to be handing back to my colleague Lucy to tell us a little bit about what all of this discussion means for the context of ISEAL's new integrated draft code. Lucy, back to you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Vidya, and the panelists for that discussion. So yes, in terms of the ISEAL Code of Good Practice, if I take us back a couple of years, this is when the code was being developed and thinking about all this topical issue. And it's a significant challenge in regards to there's multiple actors at play here. the situation is changing rapidly over time. So it's not only thinking about the due diligence space as a whole, but also reflecting on what role do sustainability systems have, and then what role does the code have in supporting those systems and contributing to this space. So that was really our first step, was to think about what role can the code play here as part of the wider work that both ISEAL is doing and as the context in general. And really the high level summary here of what the code aims to do is that it is ensuring that sustainability systems can articulate their role in due diligence. So when we have the ISEAL Code of Good Practice, by referring to those credibility principles and the requirements within that, they are having to define their own responsibility. And that's the really important factor here of what the code is including, is the scheme's own responsibilities, but then also thinking about how they're defining their role in supporting the wider corporate due diligence efforts. And what the code does is it provides a framework in which a sustainability system can look at the code, look at the requirements, and it enables them to integrate these practices that support this into their operations. What the code isn't doing is it's not going into the detail of a specific scheme's due diligence requirements, for example, or their role in detail, and it's not defining the different due diligence criteria. Instead, it focuses on that almost framework perspective, that what are the decision-making processes that are needed? How are the procedures structured and implemented in a way that can achieve this? What stakeholder engagement is needed and what governance is there? So it is that higher level approach, but by taking these principles and taking these requirements, at the end of that, a sustainability system is able to articulate their role, and that's very clearly defined. The strategy that the code has taken to enable this outcome and achieve this aim, there's two main strategies really. The first is that the code overall is taking a more holistic approach to the responsibilities of a sustainability system. If I explain what I mean by that, in one way it's because the ISEAL code is applicable to the system as a whole, and because it's really reflecting on the overall strategies for impact that that system has, and thinking about credible practices across the range of a system's activities. And I'll explain more on what I mean on that in just a moment. But the second way that we've achieved this within the code and that we're hoping to get feedback on is by also the specific requirements. So we have either directly referenced due diligence within the code, and that hasn't been something that's done previously, or we're strengthening existing requirements to really enable it to deliver this overall and higher level impact there. So they're the two main strategies. I mentioned that we were thinking about the holistic approach, and there's a couple of ways to go into detail here. So this slide is presenting a graphic that's been adapted from OECD, but in the right-hand corner, we also have the chapters of the draft ISEAL Code of Good Practice. So the code has 8 chapters that follow a logical sequence for scheme implementation. So starting with defining the purpose and strategies, then leading on to governance, and then right through to making sure that the assurance system is reflective and accurate based on this, and then that there's a claim system that's appropriate. And if you do want to find out more detail about exactly the details within each of those chapters, there's much more information on our code consultation webpage. But really what I'm communicating here is that the code in these chapters apply to the system as a whole. And then equally, because this is applying to the system as a whole, it means that it's applying to the whole process of due diligence. So with these 6 stages of due diligence, you can also map roughly the chapters, and you can see that throughout the whole code is relevant to these different stages of due diligence. So it's really taking that high level approach. It's not really about the specific requirement and that one element, it's the bigger picture there. And this is just an example. There's a much more complex mapping that we could do for the ISEAL code. There's lots of interoperability and connections here. And there's also many different due diligence laws and regulations that could have a different cycle, but it just goes to show how we're approaching this in terms of the code. And it's really about application of the code to the whole system, but equally then application to the whole process of due diligence and strengthening the whole of the scheme's operations to enable it to have a clearly defined articulated and effective due diligence requirements and processes there. To go into a little bit more detail on a subset of requirements, this slide here just focuses on particular clauses that were most relevant in terms of being new, or also strengthening it and directly referencing due diligence. So this doesn't capture everything, it's just a subset, so I can illustrate the point in a bit more detail. So firstly then, requirement 1.2. This is within the first section where the system has to really define their purpose and strategies and develop all of their processes based on this. And within this particular clause, there's the requirement that there's the assessment of sustainability risks and the materiality of sustainability issues across the full proposed scope and reach of its scheme. So that's a really important part of that whole process of developing strategies for impact. Then moving on to scheme governance and integrity. This is in terms of the contractual measures where with an example of directly referencing due diligence, and it's then again focusing on how that can be done effectively with reference to those risks. Moving on to the stakeholder engagement chapter, we've got 3 clauses, and this is an example again of where we're having a much more direct reference, and that where there are these processes that are relevant to supporting effective due diligence, that they're effective, that they're accessible, robust, transparent, and that process is very clearly defined and effective. And then lastly then on claims, that the scheme owner will define which information informs and substantiates different types of claims. So that includes the scheme's role in due diligence and remediation efforts of clients. So this is just a snapshot, an example of some of the detail that we've gone into the code to really strengthen these requirements. But as I said, it's a part of the wider strategy, the wider code implementation that we're aiming to achieve. And part of that wider context also goes beyond the code. And this is where I'll just hand over to David, who's going to talk through more about how the code fits into the wider work of ISEAL in relation to this topic.
Great, thanks, Lucy. And just to add that what you've just heard is really the basis of our current consultation, right? So if you think some of these clauses should look differently, if they have ideas of how to improve these, how to be more ambitious, that's exactly what we would want to hear about in our consultation, of course. Now, what I just want to quickly stress before we go back to our panel is that the code is really the starting point. The code is providing that overall framework, as Lucy was explaining. In addition to that, we work closely with our members on a range of specific areas where we get probably into a bit more of the specifics of due diligence implementation. And we do that by developing guidance for them, by also supporting them on and testing and innovating new mechanisms, new approaches, new technology, etc. And so some of these, a lot of the focus, for example, is on improving risk identification and monitoring data. Now, that's been a focus of ISEAL for a very long time, but it gains renewed importance and relevance in light of due diligence, of course. Then mitigation and improvement pathways is something that is, I think, crucially important, because what we see is that mitigation, if it's understood and interpreted as a way for companies just to avoid risks, then that's exactly the type of implementation that's not really going to have substantive impacts. So if sustainability systems and standards can define impactful mitigation and improvement pathways, that's really going to help clarify things about what actually needs to be done to address these problems at their heart. Then innovating and adopting grievance and remediation processes. This is an ongoing work stream where Vidya can probably talk in a bit more detail about that. But that's of course something where it's really crucial that it's not just a procedure, but that there's a really good understanding about effectiveness in remediation, and there's a whole body of knowledge coming from the OHCHR and other organizations that we're building off in that work stream. And then there's a big debate within ISEAL for quite a long time, of course, around smallholder inclusion. And this kind of even is, again, the due diligence lens to this makes this question of smallholder inclusion even more pertinent today, I think, than when we started talking about this at ISEAL for long time ago already. And actually, I forgot to put the last one on there, and this is something that Emily actually brought up in the first panel, this idea of shared responsibility. So how can sustainability systems or standards think about creating responsibilities and obligations both upstream and downstream, and in that way facilitating that cost sharing that will need to happen for due diligence implementation. Already in the chat, we've seen several comments come true around this question of cost sharing. And it is indeed one of the things that will need to be unlocked to really see effective implementation. Some of our members have already thought about and iterated ways to do shared responsibility through their systems. But of course, there's much more to unpack and to innovate on that front as well. So I'll leave it at that and turn back to Vidya for the panel.
Thanks so much, Lucy and David, for setting the context of what our vision is with the ISEAL, integrated code of good practice, as well as what we can expect from it as a starting point. In the interest of time, I'm going to bring one question to each of our panelists rather than go into a discussion, because I do want to save time for questions from the floor. So to all of you who are participating, if you have a question, please put that into the chat box. We'll try our very best to get a response to it either live or indeed via chat or offline. So in terms of discussing, and your thoughts on the draft code, Dorothy, let me start with you. You said at the start, governance is key. Do you think in this new draft one code, that aspect of what those key elements are of stakeholder consultation governance have been well captured? Your feedback on that?
That's a hard question, but I love that you consult stakeholders on that code, and I think it can't be strengthened enough. So it's important to, as I mentioned earlier, that from that governance question, everything else flows. To us, it's the condition that gives legitimacy to rules that are equally binding as legal rules, in a sense that unless you comply, members are penalized for non-compliance. So that you can only do if there's multi-stakeholder engagement in the definition of common expectations. And so this, I really think, is so foundational that unless this is in place, we're creating more organizations that at the extreme end are industry bodies, maybe disguised as multi-stakeholder initiatives, but are de facto industry bodies. And that leads to a situation where the fox is watching the henhouse, in a way, that we have organizations defining rules for themselves in a way that is favorable to them, but do not focus on the rights holders that should ultimately benefit from this exercise.
Thanks, Dorothy. And that segues really nicely into a question, Emily, which I want to pose to you. So, Dorothy and you in your opening remarks spoke a lot about how we have several sustainability standards and MSIs in operation now. And obviously what ISEAL is intending with this one code is that there is a marker of what the credible practices are that underpin a system. Do you think that there are, the draft one code is trying to make that distinction clear enough? And what do you think are going to be the key benefits for sustainability systems, voluntary systems out there from adopting these changes that we're proposing in the code?
No, thanks. And thank you for the presentation, because apologies, I'm not as familiar with the code as I'd like to be. I think definitely it seems like you're going down absolutely the right track, and we're much more familiar actually with the other codes of good practice that you're building from and integrating into this, because we've very much looked at them in the context of our own credibility assessment, and we've really turned to them. So I think clearly very progressive markers, and I think brilliant to have those as a standard. I think maybe my one reaction is that I think it's really helpful to think through the 6-step framework and how initiatives can contribute to each of those, but I feel like we shouldn't be sort of sitting back and saying what is the role of initiatives and this is where they integrate in and this is where they don't, because I do think we are going to be still dealing with a lot of different models a lot of different approaches. We are going to deal with some that have extremely good remediation mechanisms and systems, and those, from my experience with the initiatives that do have those, that's a lot of work. It's brilliant data management, etc. It's very impressive. But should we really be expecting that of every initiative out there? So I do think this slight recognition, as we try to make in our paper that David kindly sent around, that these initiatives will have different roles to play. They are doing different things. They're looking at different bits of the supply chain, and as a result, their approaches are different. And so I think, again, for us, they will have very different roles is where I'm going. And I think that's why for companies to understand that, for governments to have a typology, and we're working also with ISEAL and ITC actually on a typology of these initiatives, so that everyone's clearer on how the jigsaw puzzle fits together. That's so fundamental. So I think as long as this is going in the direction of markers, like you said, but I think there are just risks of putting too much on all these initiatives to change and evolve. And I think also, I'm thinking of the Accords, the smaller initiatives that are highly effective, and leaving them out of a credibility system, and they then don't become credible is a tricky one. And that's where I think with our alignment assessment, we really try to have that flexibility in how we scope different initiatives. And then we actually need to work, and we're really working on this for our own, how we present initiatives, their scope, their risk scope, their geographical scope, their company scope, all of that needs to be so clear to then be, for companies to then pick and choose, and governments to also to understand. So that would be a sort of one reaction.
Thanks, Emily. So the bottom line there being really focus on clarity of purpose, of scope, of criteria, of standards, so that whoever is picking up that scheme knows what to expect from it, and those who are tracking and monitoring the performance of the scheme know what to measure it against. So thanks, Emily. Archana, one last question to you before we take questions from the floor. David sort of stressed the point that the code is a starting point. It's not going to cover everything. That's not the intention. And it's certainly not going to, it's not setting the bar of what good looks like. It's hopefully setting the base of what good looks like. Your thoughts on what schemes should be thinking about in this space, going beyond what ISEAL is asking for in its one code?
Sure. I think it's really important to start at the point of what lessons have we learned from the past, and what can we do differently. For example, the over-reliance on social audit, the being part of, an MSI and feeling like that's the be all and the end all of it, the attitude to, of one size fits all and one system will work for everybody. I think there has never been a bigger call for a more tailored approach to risk, sector, geography, being really tailored. And that's the only way one can do risk management. And I'd really like to echo the point that Emily made earlier. I think, one of the things I'd really like to see change is the creation of industry-based grievance system that really create, sort of a level playing field, accessibility for workers who work for smallholders, for SMEs, and for various others, and to create a collective pool of good practice data and access points for these individuals, but also for companies that find it very difficult to access entry points. The other aspect in which I think there could be some solidification or consolidation is engagement with stakeholders. I think that's not really emphasized enough. And I'm not just talking about affected groups, but I'm also talking about engagement between the private sector and the states. And very often, MSIs or sustainability systems become a really good convergence point, and a point at which there is enough leverage in order to do that kind of engagement very positively. It is really important that this kind of engagement takes place, because again, I'd like to underscore the complementarity of state-based and non-state-based measures, very much like there's a complementarity between state-based and non-state-based grievance mechanisms as well. And I think, the alignment to the UN Guiding Principles, which really is the best operational framework, and the OECD guidelines cannot be underscored enough. I think in the way the systems are designed, the systems are built and made accessible, one really needs to engage with DD, with due diligence as an iterative process. And often, it looks like something that is done. It's a system that it's put in place, and then that's it. So I think that those are some of the things that really need to be added, because, really the key benefits of sustainability systems adapting to these changes to help build resilience, particularly in face of changing geopolitical climate and the convergence of human rights and environmental related issues. And there will be a much bigger space for collective action, better industry standards, and the creation of more leverage with engagement with regulators and the private sector, but also the NGO sector as well. And just to leave it on a point that, accountability and transparency do make for better business through better management of legal, financial, and reputational risks. And, one must always keep that in mind as we navigate through what are very likely to be choppy times ahead.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Archana, and indeed to all three of you for those responses to the questions. Let's now open up and take some from the floor. And I see a lot about SMEs. So let's talk about SMEs. I'm going to club together two questions that we have. One's from a participant, which is really talking about how and where should SMEs which are based in Europe, to whom these mandatory new requirements directly apply, how and where should they actually start even thinking about questions of risk assessment and due diligence, given that they work sometimes at the heart of also very complex supply chains. So do you want to take that, Dorothy, and maybe Emily, do you want to jump in as well? What sort of guidance, if any, can you give to SMEs which are operational within Europe, to whom all of this is going to be a significant raising of the bar in terms of legal requirements and who operate in complex supply chains?
Yes, so of course, my response would be that for SMEs, the engagement with multi-stakeholder initiatives even has greater value, because clearly their individual resources and leverage is fairly small, but as they team up with much larger companies and as a group, they can work towards the desired outcomes. They can pool resources, they can pool expertise, and they become part of a movement towards mandatory human rights due diligence. So I think for them to team up and work through multi-stakeholder initiatives adds even more value.
Thanks, Dorothy. Emily, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, no, I mean, I would agree, but I think we are also, unfortunately, at the point where, a lot of initiatives, we don't really know what the costs are. We don't really know what the fees are. I totally agree with you, but I also think we need to be able to say to SMEs that you can do due diligence. These collaborative initiatives are out there. And they're very valuable, but I think also ultimately our standards do allow for the proportionality, the reasonableness, if you like, of what is expected of SMEs. And so, if you're talking, for example, of an SME in the garment sector that is, for example, very often, in fact, has a very strong relationship with its tier one supplier, you would expect a dialogue to happen there, and there would be a degree of dialogue about what the upstream, I mean, based on the products, we would sort of have an expectation called the scoping exercise that you undertake in the very first step of your due diligence, where you're really thinking broadly about all the different types of direct, even just your tier one suppliers, the different types of business relationships you have, the different types of products you're dealing with. So in agri, there are going to be some particularly garments, there will be some particularly high risk products, whether it's in relation to water contamination, for example, water use. So considering what your risks are, that would be most likely starting to those dialogues with your direct suppliers. And then I saw the question about a lack of leverage beyond that. And of course, the standards very much are based on the concept that you use the leverage where you have it, you try to build, and as Dorothy said, you could use, if there are relevant initiatives that you can afford, it does make financial sense and it would help you. But ultimately, if you don't have enough leverage, and that leverage is very hard to get, you're not on the hook, you're not sort of liable. The SMEs, there would be instances where there would be a sort of tier 1 focus that's totally reasonable for the first period of time, whilst there's an effort to get more visibility on the upstream and to better understand the upstream. And I think that's where the laws, we really would hope that the law builds in this proportionality, this flexibility, and hopefully also through guidance and tools for SMEs. But that, yeah, I hope that sort of vaguely answers.
Thank you, Emily. Archana, a question to you about SMEs, but probably more based in supplier countries. So how can SMEs in supplier countries deal with the heterogeneity of regulation and standards that they're likely going to be faced with? That is already an issue. There is already a large number of schemes out there, and now we potentially are looking at, as David's slide at the start shows, a large number of mandatory requirements coming through as well. What sort of strategies do we need to be adopting to support them better that could ensure that this is a meaningful engagement for them rather than just a huge burden?
Yeah, I mean, it is very problematic, and it's something that is coming up more and more now, particularly as, for example, with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act coming into force, we have seen a lot of the smaller suppliers be hit with, signing declarations, etc., committing to traceability, committing to various other DD practices, which they simply can't afford at this point in time, and they just don't have access to. So one of the areas where we are seeing some positive movement is in the area of remedy, where we are seeing increasing efforts of the larger companies to come together with the SMEs in order to formulate a strategy or a way of working together to make grievance systems more accessible to workers of SMEs, to do a lot more, provide them with capacity building resources and tools that they can access free of charge, so that the business relationship can be a business relationship that is a lot more integrated, sustained, and fulfilled. And this allows to sort of reach a degree of standards. We're not seeing that across the board though, and I think looking at the slew of legislation that is coming down the pipeline, it is really important for the legislators to be thinking about what kind of investments, and to potentially spell a little bit of that out in the law to make it clear that there needs to be a reallocation of resources along the supply chain, and that there is a responsibility on the larger players to sort of realign the way they do their purchasing so that it is not so punishing on suppliers, and also that standards can be raised across supplier base. But again, would like to echo Emily and Dorothy's point earlier that MSIs and sustainability systems play a very critical role in providing that access point to SMEs.
Thanks so much, Archana. I don't see any other questions in the chat box. David, did you want to come in with a thought or a question?
Yeah, and I think there is actually a comment in the chat box that I can kind of recycle or adapt, and this is about clearly the legal departments of companies are now going to start playing potentially quite a big role in terms of how supply chains are managed and shaped. And so a lot of legal departments are not really set up to think about complex sustainability issues or supply chain dynamics or smallholder inclusion at all. So I think we've been in a space where sometimes the marketing departments have used sustainability standards and overclaimed in a lot of different ways, and now potentially we're going into a space where the legal departments of companies take over, and the question is that better, or maybe the question is, how should we find a balance? Because I feel it's certainly something that we as ISEAL are also getting more questions about, providing legal analysis, integration and contracting and all that type of stuff, as you would expect. but obviously there's more to it than just the contract side of it, as we've kind of been hearing from throughout the whole, our panel, right? So maybe any closing thoughts on this idea would be useful.
I'll jump
David.
in. I'll jump in, Vidya, because we're seeing so much of this. It's a real issue that we seem to be dealing with. One thing is that previously it was very much the CSR teams of companies that were dealing with issues around sustainability. Now, since the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, with also the due diligence laws that are coming up, the legal teams, legal and compliance, have now got involved. Sometimes things fall through the net between these two teams, but there is a need for both of these to align on this point, and even within companies to have a bit more of a seamless work, because actually these issues address and affect a whole range of business functions and must be addressed internally by the business as a whole, as an ecosystem, as opposed to a particular person in legal or a particular person in the CSR space. So it is a very technical area, and it is one that does require a feathered, multi-layered sort of, response from companies as well.
Thanks, Archana. Dorothy, did you want to very quickly jump in?
Yes, with pleasure. It's one of my favorite topics. But of course, my response is biased in that I'm not a legal scholar. I'm at a business school. And to me, the legalization of the business human rights field is not just positive. Actually, I do see unintended consequences from this development, in that the lawyers at companies are so exclusively focused on risks. And it has sometimes, unfortunate effects, such as with the emergence of mandatory human rights due diligence, I know of some companies who are already silently moving out of certain jurisdictions where systemic human rights issues are particularly difficult to address. So they essentially cut and run versus, mitigating and addressing these risks before the laws become fully effective. So as a safeguarding move, I would rather, see the business human rights as a space that also comes with a lot of opportunities. And the legal perspective is so exclusively focused on risks that I'm afraid we will use the more attractive side of this field, where we can create business and innovate business models that allow, as we say, profits and principles to be aligned. And we should really counter this potential effect of the mandatory human rights due diligence requirements and the legalization of the field.
All right. Thank you all so very much for that. We're completely out of time, and I do need to hand back to Lucy to help us conclude. So thank you so much to the participants for questions and the panelists for very rich contributions. But for now, Lucy, back to you to conclude.
Thank you very much. So before we do want to finish, we just want a very quick poll on your thoughts from this webinar and the topic we've covered and how that relates back to the ISEAL Code Good Practice. So Carla's going to launch the poll now, and there's just 4 questions. Very quickly, would just like your high level, quick thoughts on these. So it's thinking about whether there's any change in perception on the role of due diligence and sustainability systems. Do you think the draft code has the right level of ambition? And what do you see as the most challenging aspect of sustainability systems in due diligence space? And where do you see the greatest movement? And again, this is just a very high level. We'd love to happen after this webinar, and if you're able, for you to participate in the code consultation. So I mentioned it closes on the 16th of December, and there's a number of ways that you can provide your feedback, including a survey, an Excel spreadsheet, and there's also a wide range of resources that you can look at that give you a much more detailed summary of the code, or equally a very high level summary. So if you were just interested in providing feedback on due diligence, for example, the survey allows you to do that. So you can just focus in on that specific topic, or you could just download the spreadsheet and focus on that one there. And then the last thing to do is to make you aware that we do have additional events coming up, and that's focusing on a policymaker's perspective on the ISEAL Code of Good Practice. That's happening on the 27th of October. And then innovation and credibility across a range of sustainability systems. So really exploring this conversation more about how this code and our framework fits into different contexts, And you can also find recordings of all previous events on the Code Consultation Events webpage. And Carla's just popped those links into the chat box. So that just brings me to say thank you very much. It's been a really engaging and interesting webinar today, and we're really looking forward to going into the detail of the remarks that were made, and a special thank you to the panel for your fantastic contributions and your time today. Thank you, everyone.